welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I am, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 59th episode, our guest is Robert Dunham. Robert Dunham is an attorney and nationally recognized expert on the death penalty. Before becoming the Death Penalty Information Center's executive director, he was one of the leading capital appellate lawyers in Pennsylvania, arguing on behalf of the Commonwealth's death row inmates in its state and federal courts and in the United States Supreme Court. He served as executive director of the former Pennsylvania Capital Case Resource Center from 1994 to 1999, director of training of the Capital Habeas Unit of the Philadelphia Federal Defender's Office from 1999 to 2009, and as an assistant federal defender in the Harrisburg Federal Defender's Capital Habeas Unit from 2009 until March 2015. He started his legal career as a litigation associate at Schnader, Harrison, Segal, and Lewis in Philadelphia, where he handled his first pro bono capital case. He previously served 5 years as a legislative assistant to State Representative Robert W. O'Donnell, later the Speaker of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He has taught in death penalty training programs offered by national, state, and local courts, bar associations, and professional organizations for more than 20 years. He was an adjunct professor of law at Villanova Law School for 11 years, teaching death penalty law, and he has also taught death penalty at Temple Law School and as a visiting scholar at Oklahoma State University. He is a life fellow of the American Bar Association and has served on the steering committee of the American Bar Association's Death Penalty Representation Project and on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, the Pennsylvania Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and the Philadelphia Crime Victim Assistance Program, Northwest Victim Services, for whom he has also served as board president. A native of Philadelphia, he received his undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was a university scholar in philosophy. He received his law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C., where he served as managing editor of the Georgetown Law Journal. At Georgetown, he received the Milton A. Kaufman Prize for Outstanding Contribution to the Journal and the Jeffrey Crandall Award for Commitment to Public Interest Law. And now, on to the show.
I'm Robert Dunham. I'm the Executive Director of the Death Penalty Information Center. We're a national nonprofit organization that provides information and analysis on death penalty issues. We're not an advocacy organization, so we don't take a position ultimately for or against the death penalty, but we are critical of the way in which states and the federal government have been administering it.
Okay. Now, as I know, I've read your biography here, and so you've been a lawyer involved in death penalty cases for quite a while. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
I was the director of the Pennsylvania Capital Case Resource Center, which was one of the 18 resource centers that Congress authorized the creation of in the 1980s and 1990s when the courts in Congress realized that death row prisoners were getting inadequate representation, and the courts had seen a lot of prisoners be executed despite having valid constitutional claims because they were unable to get the claims presented at an appropriate time to the appropriate court. So I did that for 5 years. Congress defunded the resource centers in the mid-1990s, and I moved to the Philadelphia Federal Defender's Office, where I was director of training in their Capital Habeas Unit. I did that for 10 years and then was in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Middle District Capital Habeas Unit before I was offered the position here at the Death Penalty Information Center.
But how have you seen the death penalty in this country change over the years here? We've obviously seen more lethal injection. I know we used to have more, I felt like, gas chamber situations before and things like that. So in your time, when you've been working, how have you seen the death penalty change in America?
Well, the death penalty has changed in a number of ways, and executions are only a small part of it. When I began handling death penalty cases in the 1990s, when I went to receptions or fundraisers, things like that, public appearances, I would invariably get somebody who'd said to me, "How can you represent these people?" And this was in the height of the fear of crime epidemic in the United States in the 1990s. And at that time, we had 315 people sentenced to death in a single year. Now we're looking at 30 death sentences in a single year. Last year we had one new death sentence imposed for every 10 and a half death sentences that were imposed in 1996. And by the time I left representing people on death row to take the job at the Death Penalty Information Center, people were not questioning the work that I did. Instead, the kind of gratuitous comments, offhand comments that I would get would be, you've been doing God's work, and why is it that we still have a death penalty at all? So I noticed just personally that there was a climate change that had taken place about the death penalty. And when you look at the national public opinion polls, that certainly seems to be the case. Because in the 1980s, late 80s going into the early 90s, Gallup measured support for the death penalty at 80%. And last year, the Gallup poll said it was 60%. And the Pew Research Center measured support for the death penalty at 78%. And last year, they had it at 49%. That's a very, very significant change. Last year, there were fewer new death sentences than at any time since the U.S. Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional in 1972, and the states then started bringing it back in 73. There were the fewest executions in 25 years, and fewer and fewer counties are even seeking the death penalty. So there's been this huge change. When it comes to the way in which the death penalty is carried out, in the modern era, which we say starts in the 1970s, in the modern era, at the start of the modern era, you had executions by hanging, you had executions by firing squad, you had executions by electric chair, and you had executions by lethal injection. Now, every state does executions by lethal injection. Some have these other methods as backups. And the reason was that the public thought that all these other methods were brutal. They were viscerally unacceptable. They were violent. And the lethal injection had the kind of synthetic appearance of civility, because you didn't see an inmate visibly suffering. It had the appearance of a peaceful passing. And at that same time, in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, we were seeing botched electrocutions. Florida had a case where one of the prisoners literally caught on fire, and blood was seen streaming from the hood that they'd put over his head. Part of that was because the personnel were not properly trained, and for some inexcusable reason, had attempted to use a synthetic sponge instead of a natural sponge, and the synthetic sponge caught on fire when they used it in the electrocution. But I've had colleagues and I've had friends who've had clients who were electrocuted, and they reported to me. They still have difficulty talking about it 20 years later, that they went in to see a client whom they had spent years representing, and had developed a relationship of trust and confidence and understood the person's emotional frailties. And they watched the person be electrocuted in front of them and talk about how to this day they can't get the smell of the singed hair and burned flesh out of their mind. And the public doesn't have the smell and the sight of it, but the public is aware of how violent and just viscerally unappealing that method of execution is. States moved away from that to lethal injection. So that's been the big change. But now we're understanding that lethal injection is not the peaceful passing that the people thought it would be, and that in fact, especially after the pharmaceutical companies have essentially boycotted the lethal injection process. They don't want their medicines used to kill prisoners, and the states have moved to using drugs like midazolam, which is a really good sedative for tooth extractions and colonoscopies. But even with tooth extractions, it's not an anesthetic. They use Novocaine with it. It's inappropriate for executions. And with the use of midazolam, we've seen executions that have taken 2 hours. We've seen people gasping for 45 minutes. We've seen a lot of people who were visibly conscious when they should have been unconscious and would have been aware of being suffocated by the paralytic drug that was being used, and they would have felt like they were drowning, and they would have been conscious when the potassium chloride, the killing drug, chemically, the description in the Supreme Court argument is like the chemical equivalent of being burned at the stake. So they were conscious as that burning sensation seared through their veins on the way to stopping their heart. So the nature of the death penalty has changed. It's being used a lot less frequently. The public is shying away from it, doesn't want it used the way that it was being used in the past. And we now have significant problems with every method of execution.
Yeah, well, you just brought up so many things I want to cover there for sure. Though I kind of feel like what's happened in Arkansas is a kind of a great microcosm of kind of like you're describing everything that's been wrong with the death penalty, including the lethal drug shortage. Now, I feel like I heard a argument from maybe Antonin Scalia or somebody on the Supreme Court saying, this is just it with the drug makers and them not producing the drugs. It's like, well, this is just a backhanded way to fight the death penalty. If you want to fight the merits of the death penalty, you should do that on its face, and then people or whoever pressuring these drug companies not making these anymore, it wouldn't be this botched execution or whatever if they just had the correct drugs. So what's your response to that line of thinking?
Yeah, that was Justice Alito.
Oh, okay.
In the argument on Glossop versus Gross, and he described what he called a guerrilla war against the death penalty, which was really interesting because there is nothing improper with people advocating for or against the death penalty. And if you change the context a little bit, and you think of the issue of, let's say, provision of abortion services, where there is overt and in some cases direct confrontations with people who provide the services. The Supreme Court has emphasized that they have First Amendment rights, and those rights need to be protected. And so limiting the speech opportunities of people in that setting, and I just picked that issue because it's one in which the Supreme Court has spoken. That's critically important to protect the free speech rights of people who are behaving in a lawful manner, even if it's deemed as hostile by other people. I thought it was very interesting that in the context of capital punishment, when there is protest against a increasingly disfavored public policy, that the members of the court who are the most vocal proponents of the death penalty felt that the death penalty is so unstable and under such siege that they used extraordinary political rhetoric in talking about the free speech activities of Americans and others. But apart from that, there actually isn't any evidence that anybody has been harassed by opponents of the death penalty. And the evidence that's been developed over the years actually indicates that the drug manufacturers themselves want nothing to do with capital punishment. And that's when you think about it, that makes sense. Because who are the drug manufacturers anyway? And what's their corporate culture? Well, people think of Big Pharma as a major financial, a big business. But there are actually two separate cultures that are in place in the major pharmaceutical companies. The first is the employees who develop the medicines, and the second is the marketers. And they have different concerns, but both of the concerns lead them to not want to participate in lethal injection. First, when you talk about the people who are developing the medicines, the corporate mission of these big companies, and they are big companies, but the corporate mission is to save lives, to improve lives, to improve health. They don't want, the people who develop these medicines, the doctors and the scientists, don't want their life's work trying to save people to be used to terminate the lives of people involuntarily. And so there is internal opposition to the lethal injection drugs, the medicines, being misused as lethal injection drugs. The people who invented these drugs don't want that to happen. They don't want their life's work tarnished. And on the business side, it's actually bad business for the companies. You know, every company wants its good name to be in place. When you think of the National Football League and what the steps they've taken to try to prevent concussions, or Major League Baseball and the steps they've taken to try to prohibit the use of steroids, all of that is to preserve the corporate good name and the integrity of their product. It's the same kind of thing when it comes to the pharmaceutical companies. Johnson & Johnson is a family company. Think of whatever the slogans are for all the companies. Their good name has a financial value. And the public image of their products also has a financial value. And they believe that if their medicine is come to be thought of as a killing drug, that disparages the product. That diminishes the financial value of the product. And if I'm going to have a tooth extraction with Novocaine, or I'm going to have a cardiac catheterization, and someone is going to give me a sedative to go with it, I, as a patient, I don't want to have the drug they use to kill people. So those are, that has more to do with the drug companies essentially pulling out of the lethal injection market and saying that we are going to adopt controls on the distribution of our product because we don't want it used for off-label purposes. That's illegal. We don't want it used for non-medical purpose, and killing prisoners has never been an approved medical purpose. And we just don't want our product associated with death when it's all about life. Mm-hmm. That's why the pharmaceutical companies are against their medicines being used in executions.
Right, and then you kind of have another on the flip side of it with the states. I know Arkansas was one of the states that either keeps. I don't know if they do keep. I think they probably do keep the drug manufacturers, the drugs they use secret, or the exact particular secret. I know here in Indiana, we just had a thing go through the legislature here with the budget that says that we can now do that, I guess, too, and not say what drugs we're using. So, I mean, these drug companies have these objections. But if they don't know their drugs are being used for these, that they can't really pinpoint, where it's happening. So,
well, that's the actual purpose of the secrecy provisions that we're seeing states that want to carry out death penalties adopting. In fact, all of the states that have carried out executions recently have adopted some form of secrecy. That's problematic in a number of ways. The first is that this is an important public policy, and the government should be transparent. Whether you're for the death penalty or against the death penalty, people of good faith don't want the states breaking the law to carry out the law, and they don't want the states engaging in questionable practices to carry out the law. Initially, the states said that they needed the secrecy to protect the drug companies, so that they would not be subject to some kind of public backlash. That's hogwash.
A likely story.
It's true. It's true that there is a backlash when a company's drugs are used in executions, but the backlash is coming from the companies themselves. It turns out that the secrecy provisions are not there to protect the companies from adverse publicity. They're there to prevent the companies from learning that states are improperly obtaining their medicines and using them in execution. Now, ultimately, that's going to be futile. And the reason I say that is because we're talking about the distribution here of controlled substances. These are all drugs that can be obtained only through prescription. And the pharmaceutical companies have an obligation to track where their medicines go. They don't want their drugs to be used in executions. They have adopted policies that prevent their distributors from selling them for off-label purposes, any off-label purpose, and when they've seen that the medicines are getting in the hands of prisons for use in executions, they have specifically prohibited their distributors from selling them for use in executions, and in some instances for selling them to prisons altogether. The secrecy provisions are supposed to prevent the drug manufacturers from figuring that out. But they have developed tracking procedures, and they are now able to track individual vials of medicine. There's a hidden side of all of this because the tracking mechanisms have become more costly as the manufacturers have had to come up with new ways of ensuring that their medicines are not misdirected and misused. And I like to consider that, not like as in it makes me happy, but I like to consider it that way as a form of analysis, as a kind of death penalty tax on medical care. Because if there has to be additional protections, more administration in place to ensure that the drug does not go where it's not supposed to go, that means the distribution process is going to cost more. And if the distribution process is going to cost more, it's going to cost more not just in carrying out execution. It's also going to cost more when you have your tooth extracted, or when you have your colonoscopy, or your cardiac catheterization. And the increased cost of those procedures is a hidden death penalty tax on the general public.
Yeah, I didn't think about it that way. That's interesting. Now, you mentioned earlier a couple more primitive ways of carrying out the death penalty. I know, for example, Utah, I believe, is the only state that has it as a provision where you can use the firing squad still here. And I know there was a appellate court judge a couple of years ago that wrote an opinion saying, hey, so much problem with these lethal injection drugs, let's just go back to something like that, or who knows, maybe the guillotine or something. So, is there a way that the death penalty, in your view, could be carried out that wouldn't involve these drugs, that would be humane, or is just everything we know about is flawed in some way?
Well, the kicker in your question is that would be humane. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the judgment that legislators have to make. Pope Francis made an interesting comment when he was in the United States last year that there is no such thing as a humane execution. And by that he meant that the involuntary termination of a human life is by its nature inhumane. And when you think about it, if someone is struggling to stay alive while somebody else is killing them, that's never going to be a peaceful demise. The question is it intolerably cruel, intolerably painful, and unconstitutionally painful? Legislators, in general, if they had to do it their way, if they could get their way, they wouldn't want the states violating the law and violating drug contracts in order to obtain the drugs, misleading drug distributors about what they're going to use the drugs for. They would rather, if they could have their way, do it on the up and up. But it's become increasingly more difficult for them to do that. They're now faced with a challenge. And the challenge is, do we engage in these secretive activities and highly questionable activities to carry out executions with improper drugs that are likely to result in a synthetically civil and apparently visibly peaceful death, but one that's probably very, very painful? Or do we want to try to change to different drugs, or do we want to change the method of execution? If you change the method of execution, the Supreme Court has never said that any of the other methods of execution are unconstitutional. The problem legislators have in making that change is that the American public thinks that they're improper. There was a poll done in February of 2015 by an organization called YouGov, Y-O-U-G-O-V. And the YouGov poll asked Americans, what do they think about lethal injection? What do they think about hanging, gas, electric chair, beheading, firing squad? And a majority of Americans thought that lethal injection was an acceptable way to carry out executions, setting aside the question of the botches that we've since seen and the improper conduct in obtaining the drugs. But the method itself, most Americans thought was an appropriate method of carrying out execution. When it came to everything else, a majority felt that every other method was unconstitutionally cruel and inhumane. They did not want firing squad. They did not want gas or hanging. They definitely did not want beheading, whether it's a guillotine or the way it's carried out in Saudi Arabia. And they also didn't want gas. The issue with gas, and this is something that Europe does not understand what the U.S. states are thinking. In the Second World War, millions of innocent Europeans were gassed to death by the Nazis. And for Europe and much of the rest of the world, it isn't a question of whether it is a, quote, humane death. It is, why would you ever be considering killing your citizens in the same manner that the Nazis annihilated millions?
Yeah.
So every other method of execution is considered highly problematic, and so states have a real dilemma when they have to decide how they're going to carry out executions if they want to move away from lethal injection.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, don't ask Sean Spicer, I guess, about that. But
the response to that is, that tells you everything you need to know about the undercurrent about lethal gas.
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely. Now, my thing is, even if we could do it quote unquote humanely, and you did point out the problems with using that word in reference to this, but even if we would ever, under perfect circumstances, we've still killed innocent people in this country. We know we've done this, and we know we've done it over and over. And I've seen some statistics say that it could be 4 or 5%, maybe even more of the ones we've killed. What are the statistics that you have on that? And there's probably ones we'll never know. We killed, how many innocent people we've killed. So
that's right. We don't know. We don't know how many innocent people have been executed. The estimates are that 4% of everybody who is on death row is probably innocent. Yesterday, we had, May 11th, we had the 159th exoneration from death row since the 1970s. And when you look at that, there have been 159 exonerations. There have been something like 1,450 executions. So we're looking at one exoneration for every 9.5 executions, which is a rate of error that, if you were going to have a car crash 1 in 10 times, I think you wouldn't be driving. And so, it's a rate of error that we would find unacceptable in virtually any other public policy. And it's not the only kind of error that's present in capital cases. 159 exonerations. On our webpage, our website, there's a page on innocence, and you can jump from that page to a page on individuals who were executed with significant doubts about their guilt. We have a dozen people who are listed there, and summaries of their stories that indicate pretty strongly that we have almost certainly executed people who are innocent, and there are dozens more that we'll never know about, where there have been allegations of innocence, but the evidence never gets tested because the person has been executed. Or they were executed based on pressured statements by witnesses who had incentives to testify falsely. When Troy Davis was executed in Georgia, there was no physical evidence that linked him to the offense. There was eyewitness, in quotes, testimony from 9 witnesses, 7 of whom came forward and said that they had been pressured into testifying falsely. There had been threats against them, and they were also pressured when they had agreed to come forward and to recant. Most objective observers believe that Troy Davis was innocent, but the standard for proving your innocence once you've been convicted is so high and is virtually insurmountable that people who most objective observers would say were innocent, and every unbiased person would say could never be convicted based upon the evidence that was now available. They have certainly been executed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and then you see these cases that get a lot of attention like that kind of highlight that, but there's ones that don't get as much attention that we don't focus on as much. One of the ones for me was watching the West Memphis 3 case unfold, with the Paradise Lost documentaries and all that, and that's a case that got a lot of attention, but I just feel like that could be, that was just one we happened to know about, you know what I mean, that just happened to be getting all this, spotlight on it,
and those folks don't even count in our exoneration statistics.
Oh, really?
Because in the case of the West Memphis 3, I don't think there's a serious question as to innocence. I think that was a wrongful capital prosecution, and an innocent man was sent to death row along with the others who were wrongly convicted. But what happened was, in order to obtain his freedom, he pled guilty or pled no contest to charges that he didn't commit, to crimes he did not commit, in order to secure his release. And when I was a capital defense lawyer, I've represented clients who have been exonerated and are now free. And I, in my office, have represented clients who are now free but not technically exonerated because they pled guilty or pled no contest in instances in which they did not commit an offense, but the state was going to retry them anyway. They were going to face a death-qualified jury, the special jury that you get in a capital case that is much more conviction-prone, and they faced a life sentence if they got convicted of first-degree murder, and still possibly death. And to avoid those consequences and to be reunited with their families, they made the difficult choice to plead to something they did not do so they could secure their release.
And that's called an offered plea, is that right?
It's an Alford plea.
Yeah.
That's right. And the thing is, there are dozens of people like that who are innocent, who still have a criminal record as a result of this, and who were wrongly sent to death row. And when we talk about the 159 exonerations, and that being 1 for every 9.5 people who are executed, when you add the people who are innocent, who pled to crimes that they did not commit, we're looking at error rates that are much more substantially higher than that.
Right, and then of course if you take that plea too, you then can't turn around and sue for wrongful conviction, I assume, also, right?
Right.
So, yeah. I think race and class definitely have to figure into all this pretty heavily. Poor people, especially non-whites, seem like they're getting the death penalty far more often than people that, could, afford decent representation. A lot of these are public defender cases, I feel like. Is that kind of your view as well?
Yeah, that's almost invariably the case. So much so, there's a joke, if you will, that Sister Helen Prejean says. I don't know if she's the first one who came up with it, but she is the one who's credited with it. That it's called capital punishment because if you have the capital, you don't get the punishment. And what we see when we look across the country is that virtually everybody who is on death row is indigent. Almost everybody. There are rare exceptions, but virtually everybody is indigent, and that's important in a number of respects, because poverty plays a significant role in a lot of these offenses. And poverty plays a significant role in the disabilities that a lot of the prisoners who end up on death row have, whether they're innocent or whether they're guilty. And poverty plays a significant role in who represents you. You are much more likely to be sentenced to death if you have a court-appointed lawyer who doesn't have institutional expertise in defending death penalty cases, and a court-appointed lawyer who has to go to the court and depends upon the court for his or her business, his or her future money, and has to depend upon the court in providing money for investigators and money for mental health experts and money for forensics experts. We find that in jurisdictions that have an institutional capital defender, and I'll use Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and a couple of states as examples, there is a huge difference in the rate at which people get sentenced to death when they have an institutional defender versus a court-appointed lawyer. In 1992, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is one of the 2% of counties in the United States that has put more than half of everyone who's on death row on death row. And Philadelphia in 2001 had 131 people on death row. Up until 1992, it didn't allow the public defender system to handle death penalty cases. And the court appointment process was considered deeply flawed. In 92, the Philadelphia public defender was permitted to create a homicide unit, and they were given 20% of the homicide cases in the city. They didn't get to pick the cases. There were 20 cases at random. So from that point forward, we've had this experiment, the social science experiment. And we have the 20% of death penalty cases that go to the public defender's office and 80% that go to court-appointed counsel. Since that time, there have been 87 death sentences in Philadelphia. And if counsel made no difference, you would expect that 20% of those 87, which we can check the math, but it's something like 17 or 18, would have been public defender cases. They've had 0 death sentences. And when we look at Los Angeles, in the last, I believe it was last 10 years, the Fair Punishment Project did a study of the cases the capital cases that had been decided on direct appeal. I think it was between 2005 and 2015. And they found that although the public defender in Los Angeles handled half the cases, they had something like 10% of the death verdicts. There were another 30% of the cases that were handled by a backup conflict institutional defender. They had a small percentage of the death sentences. And a minority of the cases were handled by court-appointed counsel who had to petition the court for resources. And they had a majority of the death sentences. When Texas went to a regional public defense system in most of the state, they now have a capital defender that the counties contract with to provide services in capital cases. And when Georgia went to an institutional capital defense system, and when Virginia did that, the rate of death sentencing plummeted. So poverty and the counsel you get has a huge impact in whether you go to death row or whether you don't.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I feel like another factor that kind of figures into all that is mentally handicapped prisoners seem to be particularly vulnerable to the capital punishment. We kind of saw that play out in Arkansas here. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I believe it was the first one of the 4 they executed had fetal alcohol syndrome, and I believe his IQ was questionably, possibly in the 70s. And I know that, and you probably have more information on this than I do, but there was a Supreme Court case a couple years ago where they were trying to decide if 70 was the marker for whether or not you should be able to execute somebody. Talk a little bit about how mental health kind of plays into all this.
Well, there are 2 big mental health issues. One is the question of intellectual disability, which used to be known as mental retardation, and the other is a question of mental illness. What we see is that the U.S. Supreme Court has said that people who are intellectually disabled cannot be executed. And they said in 2002, in a case called Atkins versus Virginia, that there was an established national consensus against executing people who at that point were called mentally retarded. 30 states banned the execution of people with intellectual disability. The 20 who didn't have the death penalty at all, and then 10 of the states that had the death penalty, but specifically said you could not execute those who were intellectually disabled. The court said the direction of change indicated that the U.S. was moving away from that, and there was now a national consensus against it. What happened after that was that a number of the states that wanted to carry out executions of people who were intellectually disabled, instead of adopting procedures that would enforce the constitutional ban against their execution, they came up with procedures that made it more difficult to prove intellectual disability. So states like Georgia came up with a system that required that you prove intellectual disability by clear and convincing evidence, which has had the effect of allowing the execution of individuals whom every expert say is more likely than not mentally retarded, intellectually disabled, but they could not say that there was clear and convincing evidence of it. Texas, when it came to the question of adaptive deficits, decided they were going to engraft onto the clinical criterion whether you are able to perform certain basic functions. They would ask certain other questions, like, did people who knew you consider you to be mentally retarded? Were you able to lie effectively and escape detection? That's got nothing to do with whether someone actually has intellectual disability. And that case was argued in the Supreme Court last fall, a case called Moore versus Texas. And the Supreme Court earlier this year said that that kind of non-scientific use of lay stereotypes, pernicious stereotypes, they're the kind of things that the disability community has been fighting for years. That's an inappropriate way for determining whether someone has an intellectual disability. Texas would not exclude that person from receiving public assistance benefits that are available to people with intellectual disability, and yet would say that that same person whom they would consider intellectually disabled for purposes of social services is not intellectually disabled for purposes of execution. And states like Florida adopted this 70 IQ cutoff, saying that the clinical standard is if your IQ is below 70, you may have intellectual disability, but if you have an IQ score above that, we're not going to consider anything else. That's junk science. That's not used in the clinical community, and in fact, there are a number of test-taking phenomenon that might inflate artificially someone's IQ score. If you've been given an IQ test in the past, and are familiar with the test itself, you are likely to score higher. That doesn't mean your IQ is higher. That means there's an artificial consideration that erroneously raises your IQ. It's called a practice effect. There's a well-known phenomenon that the older a test is, the higher people score on it. No one is quite sure why, but this phenomenon has been noticed. It's been noticed for half a century. That the older a test gets, the less reliable the norms are when you score it. And so if a test was normed, it was invented in 1970, and its grading structure was set up in 1970. If you administer that same test in 1980, people are going to score as much as 9 points higher. And you will, if you have a change of even 3 or 4 points, you may take somebody out of being under 70 to above 70, and they'd be artificially excluded, despite the fact that their real IQ falls under that. So there are a range of things. There's this thing called the standard error of measurement that makes clear that IQ is not an actual number, it's a range of scores. So that if somebody scores a 73, their IQ might actually be a 68. It could be higher, but they could fall within that range. So these folks, these states, who wanted to make it more difficult to prove intellectual disability, were adopting this hard IQ cutoff that was making it so that people who had intellectual disability were still being executed. The recent executions in Arkansas, at least one person is most likely intellectually disabled, and he was executed. He was executed because his lawyers had not raised the question of intellectual disability early enough in the process, and his claims were considered procedurally defaulted. So despite the fact that he was probably not eligible for the death penalty in the first place, he was executed without any fair determination of whether he was even eligible. That's one of the big issues with intellectual disability. With mental illness, it's widely considered that people who are mentally ill are less morally culpable, less morally responsible for what they do. Now, they commit some of the most atrocious offenses. And, you know, when I describe this to folks on the street, it's like, well, what he did was crazy. And if you have something that's inexplicable, and is horrible in its violence and intensity. And what it really is the reflection of rage from someone who's uncontrollably and violently mentally ill. Those are some of the worst cases, but that doesn't mean that person is so morally culpable that they should be sentenced to death. They are certainly horrible murders, but when you have a lot of these horrible murders, and you learn that they are a product of mental illness, that changes the whole sentencing calculus. And we saw let's take the movie theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado. James Holmes, horrible mass shooting, terrible, terrible crime, and yet a jury, when it was presented the evidence that this was a mentally ill, delusional young man whose life had been falling apart because of his mental illness, 3 jurors said he should not be sentenced to death, and he was spared the death penalty. But poor defendants who are mentally ill, who don't have the luck of being assigned a qualified and high-quality institutional capital defender, but get a court-appointed lawyer who's got to ask the court for resources and doesn't get to choose the right doctor, someone who's a specialist in paranoid schizophrenia, or a specialist in bipolar disorder, or a specialist in fetal alcohol syndrome. You just get whatever doctor the court provides for you. Those people will oftentimes not have their mental illness properly presented. And worse yet, may have it presented in such a superficial way that the jury thinks, oh my goodness, this person is a violent, rabid dog that we need to put down. And that's where you have the intersection of poverty and mental illness. And we see that a disproportionate number of people who are executed are people who are mentally ill.
Yeah, it's very disturbing, yeah. As far as the preventing other crimes through the death penalty, if you want to look at it from that angle, that's not even an effective argument either, is it? I mean, it doesn't seem like states that have the death penalty or ones that use it are any safer than ones that aren't, and I've actually seen the opposite be true. Is that your finding?
Yeah, that's right. One of the major reasons you hear advanced for why the death penalty is necessary is that it deters murders. There is, in fact, no evidence that that's the case. There were some studies that have been thoroughly debunked because the methodology was completely inappropriate, that claimed that there was a deterrent effect. But the National Academies of Science took a look at the studies and said, no, there is absolutely no, there is no scientifically valid evidence. In fact, all the anecdotal evidence suggests the opposite. When you look at what states have the death penalty, the homicide rates are persistently higher in states that have the death penalty than states that don't. If the death penalty were a deterrent, you would expect the opposite. Or you would expect the rate of murders to decline in states that have the death penalty and to rise in states that don't. But that's not the case. When you look at the changes in murder rates in the United States, we see patterns going up and patterns coming down, and there's no appreciable difference in the changes in the murder rates between states that have the death penalty and states that don't. And the persistent fact that death penalty states have higher murder rates, I think that's anecdotal evidence that suggests the death penalty is not a deterrent. I don't think it says that the death penalty causes higher murder rates. I think what it tells us is there is something in the culture of those states that is significantly more violent. The violence that is present in those states is one of the reasons why there is a death penalty in the first place. But the death penalty, the presence or absence of the death penalty has nothing to do with the higher rates of murder there, and the presence of the death penalty has done nothing to reduce them. After the National Academy of Sciences did its study, the Brennan Institute for Justice at NYU in New York did a thorough study of the causes of crime, the causes of murder. And one of the factors they took a look at was the death penalty. Their conclusion was there was no evidence that the death penalty had any effect on murder rates, whether you had the death penalty or you didn't have the death penalty. So it's simply not true to say the death penalty deters. The death penalty does not contribute to public safety. And even if it did, that's the wrong question to ask. Because the question to ask is not the difference in having a death penalty and not having any punishment at all. It's what is the increased level of deterrence if you have a death penalty versus an alternate punishment. And there is zero evidence at all that having a death penalty would have any incrementally beneficial deterrent value than a punishment of life without possibility of parole.
Yeah. No, you've been involved in this in a long time. What have you seen as far as people that are for the death penalty? I've noticed a lot of Christians for the death penalty, which always blows my mind because it seems like Jesus of all people wouldn't be pro death penalty. But there's always that quote, oh, eye for an eye. But if you play that quote out, it was actually saying don't do that, I believe, is the full quote. So how do you square that in your mind with people that are for it? Because I can't get it. Is it like an American kind of cowboy thing where it's, beer for my horses, like Toby Keith or whatever? Like what is on people's minds in your view?
When you look at religion and the death penalty, most major religions are opposed to the use of capital punishment. And there is the trend that I talked about earlier, about how support for the death penalty nationwide has plummeted over the last 20 years, is also the trend that you see among all religious groups. So whether you are Catholic, whether you are a mainline Protestant, whether you're evangelical Christian, whether you are Buddhist or Jewish or Muslim, support for the death penalty is dropping in the United States, and it's dropping across all religious groups. One of the interesting things is, though, when you look at which demographic is most supportive of the death penalty, it's a combination of race and religion and gender, and in some respects, age. White, male, evangelical Christian, older. That is where that's the demographic that has the highest concentration of support for the death penalty. Among all other religious groups and different genders, women who are evangelical, white Christian evangelical, are still supportive of the death penalty, but not in nearly the same numbers as the white male evangelicals. And it's interesting, though, because just as we've seen a move among Catholics away from the death penalty, a majority of white Catholics still support the death penalty. Latino Catholics and black Catholics, a majority oppose the death penalty. When you look at black Protestant religions, congregations and affiliations, a majority oppose the death penalty. A majority of white Protestants, non-evangelicals, still support the death penalty, but the numbers are dropping. Some of the public opinion polls that have looked at religious groups have shown that people who report higher levels of religiosity, which doesn't mean faith and doesn't mean belief in mercy and humanity and so forth, but report higher levels of church attendance and things along those lines. The higher the level of religiosity and orthodoxy, the higher the level of support for the death penalty. That also, that's also something that you can't say that because someone reports higher levels of religiosity that they are against the death penalty. Sister Helen Crajon is an example. Pope Francis is an example, and there are many, many highly religious individuals who are morally opposed to the death penalty. But again, here, the trend is away from the death penalty. And the Pew poll showed that although support for the death penalty among those by themselves as evangelical Christians remained high, there was a 7 percentage point drop in support of those who called themselves evangelical Christian just between 2011 and 2015.
Wow. Well, that is amazing. So we're getting near the hour mark, and I really appreciate you being so generous with your time here. I do try to end it on a more fun note. So what music have you been listening to lately here? Well,
I'm kind of boring when it comes to that. My dad was a Broadway set designer, and the New York City Opera recently did a production of Candide, which ironically has a scene about a wrongful execution in it.
Oh, wow.
And Candide is a Leonard Bernstein opera. Beautiful music, lyrics by Sondheim and some others. So I've been listening to Leonard Bernstein and his stuff. I'm not usually that boring, but West Side Story is fabulous. Candide is fabulous. It's great American music. And so that's what I've been listening to recently.
Oh, cool. Well, is there anything else I didn't ask you about that you'd want to get in there here?
Well, there's one thing you asked about, but I didn't answer it.
Okay.
I got sidetracked. That was the question of race.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
It is absolutely true that race plays a significant role in the death penalty. The first question, when we look at race in the U.S., there are stories about white preference and there's stories about bias against people of color. Both of these factors are present in capital cases. When we look at who gets sentenced to death, the first thing that has to happen is there has to be a charging decision. And what we see across the country is that the charging decisions are influenced by race. It may be conscious, it may be unconscious, but you are much more likely to be charged with a capital offense if you kill a victim who is considered a person of value. And victims of value tend to be white, not people of color. And persons of value tend to be white women more than any other class of victims. Once you're within that box of white victims, and you take a look at who gets sentenced to death, you see that black defendants are much more likely to be charged and sentenced to death for the murder of a white victim than anybody else. And so once you go through the first level of white preference, you then have bias against defendants of color, and you find that you are much, much more likely to seek and impose the death penalty against against black defendants accused of killing white victims and Latinos accused of killing white victims. The other thing that we didn't have a chance to talk about, and we could go on for a long time about this, is the innocence cases and prosecutorial misconduct. Because there's a lot of argument that there are problems with the death penalty, but maybe we can make the evidence better. Maybe we can deal with junk science. Maybe we can fix eyewitness procedures. Maybe we can make interrogation procedures better so that we don't have so many coerced confessions or false confessions. But the one thing we can never control for is human nature. And 18 of the last 20 exonerations in capital cases have involved police or prosecutorial misconduct. And as long as we have human nature and people who are willing to cheat or who are seeking to pin charges on somebody for improper reasons, we are never going to be able to eliminate the possibility that we're going to be executing innocent people.
Right. Well, and then in one of those cases in Arkansas, you had the the prosecutor that had an affair with the judge.
That's right. And how can you have confidence in the fairness of those proceedings?
No, of course not.
But what was the outcome of the case?
Yeah, right.
The court did not consider that issue. It was not properly raised. Counsel didn't raise it at the appropriate time.
Well, thanks a lot for taking the time. I definitely want to talk again. There are definitely more we didn't get to, but I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoy this podcast, there are several ways to support it. I have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/Rob Burgess Show Patreon. I hope you'll consider supporting in any amount. Also, please make sure to comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, rate, and review the podcast everywhere it's available, which includes iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Facebook, Twitter, Internet Archive, TuneIn, and RSS. It really helps. The official website for the podcast is www.therobburgessshow.com. You can find out more about me by visiting my website, www.thisburgess.com. Until next time.